Hey everyone, this is Scott from certmedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be covering the Litespeed Cache plugin. Litespeed Cache is a free optimization plugin that's meant to be used on the Litespeed web server technology. For those of you who don't know, Litespeed is effectively a fork of Apache that's meant to solve many of the glaring performance issues in Apache to make your website faster. Now, the site that this is being used on is using Apache, so it's not going to gain the page caching functionality, but I will go through the settings and explain what each option does and which settings I recommend you use. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them in the comments below. But let's begin. So when you install the Litespeed Cache plugin, you'll want to make sure that the first option is checked to enable. If you're on a proper Litespeed web server, then you will not be getting the warning that I am saying that caching functions on this page are unavailable. Keep in mind that this warning only applies to page caching and not in the additional functionality. Furthermore, to gain access to all options, you'll want to go up to the top and select Enable Advanced Options or Show Advanced Options. On this page, not much really needs to be done. The defaults are really strong. The only thing I would suggest is if you're using RSS feeds quite actively, maybe use a service like If This Then That, MailChimp, or something that generates a lot of pings to your feed, you might want to consider caching it. Keep in mind that every time the interval is set in seconds, so you can choose how long to cache the feed. If you only add a post maybe once a week, you could set this to something fairly lightweight, maybe 3600 seconds, which is about 1 hour. Otherwise, the rest of the default suggestions are perfectly fine. You then have an additional options at the bottom. You can automatically upgrade, which means that when there's a new version of the Litespeed Cache plugin, it will update on its own without your intervention. I don't recommend this strictly because when it comes to performance plugins, an update can change drastic features to the plugin or how it handles minification, so I wouldn't really recommend it. And then the final option just shows the newsfeed in your dashboard of their latest post and news. I'm going to click Save Changes before I jump to the next section. Then you have the cache functionality. What this does is this is what actually configures the cache functionality and the page caching as well as the REST API cache for users. So one thing that's clear is there's an option to cache logged in users. It will privately cache the front end pages for logged in users. And it does have a note that you have to be using Litespeed version 5.2.1. For most websites, if you're just a simple blog and you're the only one on there, I wouldn't recommend enabling this. I wouldn't recommend enabling it either if you're using a WooCommerce based website. Cache for commenters. What this will do is it'll cache commenters that have pending comments. That way they'll see that their comment is pending and still serve cached versions of the pages for them. I would keep this option checked. I would also check the REST API box. Then you have the ability to cache the login page. They say that this option may negatively impact performance. If you notice issues with logging in, which can happen under certain configurations, I would recommend unchecking this option. So strictly from a compatibility reason, I recommend you select the option to be off. You then have the option to cache the favicon ICO request. This will just add a line to your htaccess file to improve the server performance by avoiding unnecessary calls to the icon itself. Quite explanatory. And then there's the ability to cache mobile. When this option is checked, what it will do is it'll cache mobile views separately. If you're a user who has a responsive website, which is most WordPress sites and most WordPress themes now, then you don't need to check this option, because what this effectively does is it splits the cache. Now, if you have a mobile specific theme like WP Mobile, or you're using AMP, then you do need to enable this option. For most sites though, if you're not using any of those technologies and you're just using a responsive theme, like on this staging site, I'm using Genesis, then go ahead and just leave it as off. And then you can choose the mobile user agents to include for that section above. If you have any private URLs that you need to be cached, you can enable them here. And then you can also choose to ignore certain query strings from when you're caching pages. So by default, those caching plugins exclude query strings from caching. And the reason for that is typically query strings are used to handle dynamic bits of information or specific use cases. So URL, if you have a referral, if you've ever gotten a referral link, you may notice that there's a query string and normally includes the referral ID. Well, that's a situation when you may not want to cache the page because it can have an impact on the landing page of the website that they land on. So what this does is it allows you to include query strings that may be cached. By default, it will ignore query strings when caching, so UTM and the UTM colon are excluded. You can include other query strings that you want to ignore here, which for most websites you don't need to touch. Then there's the purge option. You could purge all on upgrade, which is recommended. You typically want to purge the entire cache when you're updating anything from your theme to WordPress core. You want to make sure that your cache is completely cleared so that way anything that was new or modified immediately shows up. Then the auto purge rules are what affect the purging of your cache when you have a new post published. As I mentioned in the Yoast SEO video, one of the things that I don't recommend doing is having monthly archives or daily or yearly. So I actually recommend you uncheck this option, strictly because almost nobody will ever be accessing those pages. And then otherwise, the rest of the recommendations are pretty good. You should be using author archives effectively. You should be using post types archives, which is normally just your blog. Pages should be cleared more or less. You might be able to get away with pages being cleared, but I would just go ahead and leave it on. All pages with the recent post widget obviously should be cleared, and then your taxonomies should be cleared as well. You can then also place in a schedule URL purge. So if you have a specific page where content is going to be changed, so let's say you have a countdown page, you have a page locked behind the countdown screen that says in 24 hours, and then they'll have the ability to sign up. Maybe you're running some kind of, you're running a type of giveaway. You could go ahead and put the URL here and then choose the purge time. It will default to server time. So right now it says it's 19:57:04. That's about that would be the equivalent here of around 7:57, but it's 2:01. So give it another 4 minutes to add on and so on and so forth. You want to make sure that you're paying very close attention to server time and not local time. And then you want to make sure you're matching that up with whatever page you're determining needs to be purged at the correct time. You can also go ahead and fix your server time and make sure that it's set correctly. But that's a video for another time, but you can easily Google on how to do that. Then there's the ability to exclude settings. So the exclusions is, as it mentions, it allows you to exclude URLs from cache, query strings to ignore, and certain categories, tags, cookies, user agents, etc. More or less, you don't need to do too much here. If you have the user cache enabled though, for some unknown reason, the one thing I do recommend is that you disable caching for the administrator, the author, contributor, and editor roles, and as well as the SEO editor and manager that comes with Yoast SEO, because these are ones that will be affecting content changes on the front end. If you run a WooCommerce store, you should almost never be caching it logged in, period. But if you did, then you should see an option here for customers, which you also want to exclude from it. The reason for that is that they're logged in WooCommerce. What can happen is they may get somebody else's user profile information. They may get messed up ordering interfaces. Their orders may not even show. So it's almost always best to just not cache for logged in users unless you know what you're doing. For logged in users, it's almost always better to use an object cache system such as Redis or Memcached. Then under the Optimize tab, this is where the fun settings begin. So the Optimize tab allows you to do many of the traditional settings that you would get in a regular performance plugin. And then there are some that are not regular, and these are the ones that almost everybody should have, but Litespeed is the only one that's really innovating on the subject. I'm going to go through the options and I'm going to show you what they do on the front end and explain whether you should use them or not. So the first option is CSS minify. If you enable the option, what it will do is it will, as its name mentions, it will simply minify the CSS. So it'll take the CSS files and it will compress them down. CSS combine will combine all the CSS files into one. This is going to be the one that's most prone to errors. If you notice anything that's messed up on the front end, then you'll want to make sure you uncheck the CSS combine functionality. I'm going to see if it works while I'm logged in. And it does. So the CSS file, as you can see, was merged into the header. And even though I'm not on Litespeed, it did merge all the CSS into the one file and it compressed it as I expected. Great job on their part. And it looks like my Google fonts are also up here. There are some settings for those and we'll get into that in just a moment. I recommend enabling CSS combination even in HTTP2 because in most testing environments, and even in most real life tests, I find that the compression ratio benefits of combining the CSS files outweigh the HTTP2 benefit of parallelized request. So it's, in most situations, I just found it to be faster. So you'll have to play with it on your own site, or you'll have to hire an expert to check and perform the optimizations themselves. But the option is there. Then there's HTTP2 push. In a very simple way, HTTP2 push or HTTP2 server push allows the server to send the CSS files with the HTML request simultaneously. So in this case, what happens when your browser connects to your server, it starts to begin the request the HTML document. And after 100, 200, 300 milliseconds, the HTML will be sent and downloaded on the browser. And then the browser will go through and it'll try to find the resources it needs to download. Instead of waiting for the HTML to download, server push allows it to simply send the file the same time the HTML is requested, cutting out the initial download time of the HTML. This allows the page to render a lot faster because it doesn't have to wait for the latency of the HTML to be downloaded onto the device. I'm going to see if this option works on this server, but if your server does support HTTP2 server push, you should definitely enable it. And to diagnose if it's working or not, you should be able to run a simple test and see if the request was pushed or not. So I'm going to run this again. And my request is not being pushed, but if you enabled it, you would be able to see if the request was pushed. Around here, it will tell you that it was sent by server push, and it doesn't look like it's working for this website. I'll try clearing the cache just to make sure, but let's see. Purging all. Okay. It doesn't look like it's supported on the web server, which is totally fine. You have to check it on your own web server, but if you do have support for it, it is a great thing to have. And then there's the JS minify. It's exactly the same concept as the CSS functionality. You enable minify, you enable combine, and the HTTP2 push. Now, somebody is already going to be asking about jQuery. By default, jQuery is excluded, which is recommended. On most WordPress sites, jQuery is dependent on almost some kind of inline resource. Now, when you combine JavaScript, it has the merged JS up here in the header, and then it minifies jQuery migrate, and it splits it. So it takes the JS in the header and it merges it separately from the JS in the footer. And then it loads it with server push. You can get around this by enabling it with defer. So what this will do is it will merge the files as expected and then add the defer attribute. In the tuning section, we can modify the settings even further, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The CSS in the JS cache TTL just tells it how long to cache the resources in seconds. The default 60, that's about, I think that's a week worth of time right there. So that's how long the resources will be cached. Keep in mind that when the cache is purged, it will automatically clear and it will be fine. You don't need to lower this. It's completely acceptable at that level. Then there's the HTML minify. What this does, it will remove white space and it will remove HTML comments. But you can also minify inline CSS and minify inline JS. The minify CSS feature I find to be really useful because it'll strip out comments and optimize the inline code. The JS feature I've had hit or miss situations with. Sometimes it will cause JavaScript errors. And therefore, I wouldn't want to mess around with it too often, but if you can get it to work correctly, it can really cut down your code. As you can see, it's effectively down to 5 lines minus its 2 lines of self-promotional nonsense and debugging functionality in the footer. So the easiest way to test if something is broken, you enable the option, you go and you see if you have any error consoles. I have a warning. It's probably something extremely minor, and it's some kind of logging functionality from the Grammarly extension I have installed. So nothing from WordPress is generating an error. That's good. Check that option though. Test that option if you have very complicated layouts. I have seen it cause all sorts of issues. I think I've seen it cause issues with some of the more popular theme forest themes. I think Newspaper comes to mind, and Jupyter might have had an issue, but they did a huge update that changed a bunch of stuff, so I'll have to retest it. Just be wary. You then have the option to load CSS asynchronously, and this option gets very confused. What this does is it moves the CSS file into the footer and loads it with async. This option is meant to be combined with the critical CSS functionality. Well, critical CSS, in simple terms, allows the CSS to be inlined in the header, so that way the document doesn't have to download a render blocking CSS file and instead can only deal with the inline CSS to paint the above the fold content. That's how it's supposed to work in theory. What normally happens is you'll get a flash of unstyled content, which is where you're downloading your page and it may load really wonky. And I'm gonna see if this does it on here. So you saw how there was a quick flash right there of my menu content in the far left where it was unstyled. That is the flash of unstyled content occurring. So if you enable the option, you have to make sure that the critical CSS is being generated. If you don't have Litespeed server, like this test, this option does nothing. So if you're on proper Litespeed server, this functionality will do as it's expected to. It will generate the critical CSS. And if the critical CSS option is enabled and you're still getting wonky loading, then you very well might need to simply disable the option. While it will have an impact on the perceived performance of the website, typically the impact of the user experience of the flash is too strong and users think that the page is broken. So if you notice a flash of unstyled content with this option enabled, it's probably best to disable it. There's a lot of debate around the subject, and a lot of people say, well, people will asynchronously load the CSS file even without critical CSS and let it load all weird, but good optimization shouldn't hurt the user experience. And then there's the inline CSS async library, which will load the CSS library inline to avoid render blocking. That's totally fine. You want to leave these options enabled. Load.js with deferred, you should be doing that. If you have a theme that is not using jQuery in the header, you can disable the exclude jQuery. You're going to really struggle to find themes that are not required in jQuery in WordPress, but if you happen to have one, by all means, disable this option. Get yourself a nice little performance boost. And then you'll be able to remove comments inside the JSS and CSS files. This will just further reduce the weight of those files to make them even smaller. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the tuning section. The tuning section basically allows you to modify everything that was on the optimized section. So you have the ability to load the combined CSS files before other CSS files. So the combined CSS file, what this option does is it moves it up in the header. So that way it's the first thing that gets downloaded. As you can see, this Google font file right here is the first thing. And then there is the Google, the merge style sheet. What this did is it moved the merge style sheet to be first and then the Google fonts after it, which can be useful, but not so much anymore. Typically because we have access to HTTP2, which even though I said merging files can still be useful in those situations, the fact that the CSS file, in this case the Google font, can be downloaded simultaneously means that the priority of this isn't nearly as important. If though you have CSS files that are from themes or plugins that are not merged for some reason, then moving this above it could resolve issues with rendering. You'll have to test it though. Otherwise, there's not really any harm or direct benefit from using this from what I've seen. The same thing for the combined JS priority. You'll load the combined JS before other JS files. I haven't found any situation where that matters too much, but it's there. And then here's the one option that people get relatively confused about, and it's the max combined file size. This is the max combined uncompressed version of your CSS and JS files. So if you notice, in this case, several JS files being generated, then you could try increasing this to a higher number. I'm going to do 5 megabytes just as a test. Set it to something reasonable, depending on the size of your website, but I'm solely doing this as a test. So what this does is it allows these CSS files to be merged instead of splintering them off if they get too large. And it just solely does that to reduce the number of files that are on the website to improve the performance of the web server itself. Then you have the option to remove query strings. Highly recommend it just to delete it. They're not useful most of the time, and it will fix a warning. I think it's on Pingdom and GT Matrix. Then there's the option to load Google Fonts asynchronously. What this does is it loads the web font loader JS and then loads the Google Fonts through the JS library. Personally, in testing, I found the JS library to be slower than just loading the file now. And the reason for that is the library has quite a bit of overhead, and even though this plugin does the best it can at optimizing it, it's just not that useful. Typically loading it in one large file in the header with the display swap attribute is completely acceptable for 99% of use cases. Now, if you have an extreme amount of fonts, then you might see performance gains from the library, but I personally don't think it's necessary. And then you can remove the WordPress emoji.js, which I normally recommend doing because it's just not necessary. And it's cut out. Now, the one thing you can do is choose user roles to exclude from the optimizations, which is definitely a good thing to do for those who have login access to either edit pages or edit content to see their changes. Sometimes if you're using page builders, you may notice some unnecessary and strange behavior, or sometimes the taskbar functionality up here may appear broken or just doesn't work correctly. So it's best to exclude the roles for logged in users. If it's only you on the website and you're just the administrator, then just exclude the administrator to save yourself the time, or check all of them. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to leave it enabled though, solely so that way I can demonstrate the features, but just keep in mind to enable it or disable it when necessary. Here comes the media settings. So the media settings allows you to lazy load your images. Lazy loading effectively is just a means of saying to the browser, okay, there is nothing here until they get to the end, and then it downloads the JS library and it says, when you scroll down, anything that's in the viewport, you switch it back and load it as a image file. It's effectively just a means of cutting down the images and the request counts and the amount transferred on the initial load. So you see this image that I have up here, this mountain image that came with the demo. If I had this in the footer, like this image, there's not really any reason that the browser should have to download that image on the initial load. Because it's outside the viewport, the browser doesn't really need to start fetching it until it gets closer. So by reducing that, you see a great big improvement in performance, or at least perceived performance, on mobile devices. So typically what I do is I enable the lazy loading, and then you can choose to have a responsive placeholder. What this does is it loads a placeholder with the same dimensions as its image to avoid content restyling. It just makes it look nicer when it's loading. And then you can you can enable it for iframes as well, which is going to be your Google Maps, your videos, so on and so forth. And then I also recommend inlining the lazy load images library. This can be useful if you have a large amount of JS. I'm going to keep it off though. There's not really that much benefit either way. And then you have the ability to optimize automatically request optimization via a cron job. Requests can only be sent though when recovered credits is 1200 or more. You don't need to worry about too much about this. And then you could choose to optimize the original images and so on and so forth. I can't enable these options, but this is basically just image compression. It's like using UImage Optimizer. So I'm going to ignore these settings for this server, but if you have Litespeed, what I recommend doing is checking this option on, keep this option on, then removing the original backups should be off, then optimize WebP, optimize losslessly, then you can then make sure this option is off. The reason I have losslessly instead of lossy is because lossy can impact the visual quality of images, even though it may get you better compression ratios. Most of the time, with my experience working with clients, is they basically want their images to look exactly the same, just smaller. You can only go so far without affecting image quality, so losslessly is definitely the way to go. And then you can also enable WebP replacements, which will load a WebP version of the images to further reduce the weight. One thing that might be a secret though is JPEG or PNG to WebP is an inherently lossy conversion, so there's always going to be less, but it's definitely a lot less noticeable than compressing the JPEG and then converting that compressed JPEG to WebP. So you should enable WebP replacement and then try to use WebP for source set elements generated outside of the default WordPress logic. And then there is attributes that you can enable here that it recommends doing. But again, though, I'm going to have all of these off strictly to avoid issues with my configuration since it's not Litespeed. Once we've done that, I'm going to show you the image lazy loading. So as you can see, the image source right here has been modified from the mountain background to data image GIF base64 encoded, and it says data-lazy loaded 1, and it's probably got it down here and maybe in one other spot. So these images are now being lazy loaded, and since this initial image is in the viewport, you don't notice it. But if you scroll down here, this image is outside the viewport, so its initial request isn't being fetched. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So we're going to download this, and then we're going to click image, and the mountain image has been fetched, and as I scroll down, the home-about.jpg image was fetched after I scrolled. So I saved 437 kilobytes by not downloading this one image on initial load. That's the advantage of lazy loading. On a better lazy load implementation, you may use a fade-in effect, so that way the images feel natural instead of just popping into existence. And you may also notice less of a lag, especially if the server response time is faster. The CDN option simply allows you to rewrite URLs on the website to a pull CDN. So if you're using like Max CDN or really any general CDN, I think Bunny's CDN, whatever your host gives you, like NetDNA, which was Max CDN, but now it's called StackPath, the things of that nature, you'll put the URL in here and then you can modify the settings as need be. If you're using Cloudflare, you don't need to touch this. Now, there is one other option in here that's a little bit weird. You have the option to load jQuery remotely from either Google's CDN or CDN.js. From my experience, I don't see much of a benefit in this inherently. The reason people suggest this is effectively what happens is because the image is on a shared library or on a shared CDN, the chances of the user already having that file in their cache goes up, because users have likely already downloaded jQuery somewhere else on the internet, and since it's coming from a shared URL, being the Google CDN, for instance, then they don't have to re-download the file. You're basically relying on their browser already having the browser cache in, the JS cached in the browser. It's a good thing to have in theory. Sometimes, though, I notice that the CDN performance can be quite bad compared to using something local. It really depends, and you have to test the option. Most of the time, though, I don't enable this option because I don't notice enough an immediate benefit, even in testing, even on going through multiple sites and trying to replicate it on my own browser. I just don't see the inherent benefit in real-world use cases. In theory, though, if the browser does have it cached, they don't have to download jQuery, so the website would render faster. But you're basically relying on the fact that they have visited a website that is using the Google version, the same version from the same URL as your version of jQuery. And then there's the ESI settings. So this is edge side includes, which are pages that are to be served from cache for logged in users. So this allows you to effectively serve certain content to logged in users to reduce some server response time. And they give you a whole bit of documentation. This is a really complicated setup, and it's inherently meant to be complicated. I'm not going to go through it because it requires code modification, and you can turn shortcodes into ESI blocks, and it is deep. This is one of the deep options. If you've ever used W3 Total Cache and it has fragment caching, it's in theory the same concept. Basically, some content is served cached while some content is not served as cached. It's kind of the same concept. It's just this is a difficult thing to get set up. And then you have the advanced options. The advanced options allow you, and yes, I have a pencil, the ability to modify and set up additional features for the plugin. So for instance, if you have Redis or Memcache installed, you can enable object caching, and then you can go through and set up the host configuration, the port location, and the lifetime, as well as additional information for those options. However, I haven't found a situation where somebody knows how to set this up. And the reason for that is you're either somebody who has set up mem caching on your server, so you already know all this information, you've already set it up, so you don't need this plugin for it. And then you're the user who their host provides that similar functionality. For instance, SiteGround provides mem caching, but this information isn't easily accessible. I don't really recommend going through and doing this, and it does detect that memcache is installed, but if you have the wrong information, you're going to start getting a lot of errors, and it could cause issues with your WordPress install. So if you don't know and these tests don't pass, don't mess with the option, quite frankly. Just don't touch it. You're probably going to need somebody either professionally or the host support channel to assist you. And then there's the option for browser cache, and as it mentions, browser cache will store the files locally in the user's browser and turn this on to reduce repeated requests for static files, and they'll give you you can almost always enable this option without many issues. And then there's the improved HTTP/HTTPS compatibility. If you're using HTTP and HTTPS, what this will do is it will just simply allow the cache to be split and cache two different versions. You should never have a website where you're using two different protocol versions request versions for the website. So if you have HTTPS, the whole site should be under HTTPS and it should be redirected to it. If you have content that requires HTTP in 2020, then that's going to be on them. The onus is on them and they should fix that. And then you have the ability for when a visitor hovers over a page link, it will preload the page. This is called Instant Click. There's a bunch of other plugins that offer similar functionality. Basically, think of it this way. When a visitor is hovering over let's say they're on your e-commerce site, for instance, and they're hovering over a product that they're thinking about buying, if they click this, if you enable this option, it will allow the browser to start fetching requests to that page to download its CSS, its images, and get the page ready for the user to click on. If you have a very streamlined and well-built navigated website, this can be incredibly useful. If you're building a funnel, for instance, where your whole goal is to get them to go to your sign-up page, and the sign-up page gives them their email, and then maybe they get a book or something, and you're just trying to collect data from them, the benefit here is if you know that they're going, if you know the path to which they're going, and they're not just going to hover over a bunch of links, this can be very beneficial. However, it has two negative side effects. If you have a lot of links, a very complicated layout, and a lot of different possibilities for the user to go to, if they hover over, for instance, the view product link on 4 or 5 different products, they've effectively downloaded these 4 or 5 pages over those many times, and they may not click on any of them. So, and then you've also generated extra load on your server because the server has to send them the request for those pages, even if they don't visit them with this functionality enabled. So it's very much something you have to test, because the inherent performance value is the page will almost load instantly once they click it. Hence why it's named Instant Click. But on the other side is if the user is hovering over too many different links and there's not a clear path for them to go, then they may end up downloading 4, 5, 10 different pages just by hovering over links on the page, which would be a major detriment not only to their bandwidth, their mobile device's battery, their load times, because they're downloading 4 or 5 pages now in the background simultaneously. You just have to be careful with how you're doing it. So if you enable this, for instance, let's see what happens when I get this enabled. I'm going to see if I can get this to work clearly. So I've done 22 requests. Now, if I hover over this contact page, as you can see, the request went up to 28. It fetched the HTML, and then it fetched the CSS and the JS file. So now if I click it, it loaded up instantly. If I hover over Hello World, as you can see, it sent the request again. But now if I go to this WordPress comment, or I go to Hello World again, it's going to continue to send up all these requests. And if you do a bunch of different pages, then the requests get sent, and then they get canceled, and then they get canceled and resent. And as long as you're hovering over it, it will fetch the resources. But I'm now hovering over pages that I may not have any intention to visit, and I don't even know which ones I'm hovering over anymore. And now I'm hovering over the edit page, and now I'm sending a bunch of requests to the server for the HTML. And all of it is effectively for not a lot of benefit. If your website's already fast, you're not going to notice too much of an improvement. So you just have to test this kind of configuration. You have to see how your website's designed. And if your website is well designed, this is not an issue. If your website's not bulky and slow and heavy, again, this is not an issue. But because most WordPress websites tend to be bulky, heavy, and slow, this is not a good thing to do. And then you have the debugger. It allows you to turn everything on or off. It'll give you a debug log. And this is basically to help you figure out an issue. And if you can't figure out the issue, then it will send it to them you can send it to them to help them diagnose the issue. Final section is the crawler. Now, if you have an actual Litespeed server, this is useful to you. But if you don't, like me, then you don't get a lot of the immediate benefits. So the crawler is 500 microseconds. This is specify the time between requests during a crawl. This allows the preloading functionality. It allows the pages to be cached and preloaded. It allows everything to go on in the background. And the only thing you really need to do here is, depending on your plugin, you might need to include your sitemap URL. If you're on Yoast SEO, for instance, it's going to be sitemap_index.xml, which I can do just like this. And now it'll know the URL to my sitemap to fetch out the content as it needs. And there you go. That's basically everything you could possibly need or really want to know. You have the manage section, which the Litespeed cache management just allows you to empty out the cache. It's nothing too spectacular. You have a database optimizer, which this feature looks really similar to another plugin. I'm not going to comment which plugin, but if you've seen one of my other videos, you know what this is. The database optimizer, you can go through, you can clean it, and it'll clear out everything. And you can even clean out the CSS and the JS optimizer, nothing that's too spectacular. You can purge your CDN if it's Cloudflare. You can't purge any of the other ones from this menu. You can edit your htaccess file if you so wish from here to add manual rules, but remember, anytime you modify it, you could potentially lock yourself out. Then you have the image optimizer, which will go through and try to compress your image. And if you don't have Litespeed, it will basically not spin up. But if you're on a Litespeed server, it will allow you to compress your images. Then there's the crawler. The crawler cron, you can enable it, and this will allow it to run at a specific frequency. The cron name is guest. The run frequency is once every 10 minutes. And its status in the queue is position 1. You can manually attempt to run it. And oh look, there's already another Litespeed crawler running. And now it's going to go ahead and try to run through and crawl and preload the pages to the cache. And let's see. Current sitemap crawl began at 8. Last complete run was 3 seconds. And it said it reached the end of the sitemap file. So it went through and it cached everything in the sitemap file. And then naturally, you can go to the report menu to basically just get diagnostic information about the configuration for your plugin. And then finally, you have the import and export functionality. That is everything you needed to know about Litespeed. This plugin is deep. It is as deep as the ocean. You could drown underneath all its settings, but with those settings comes a lot of power and a lot of improvements that you don't get in a lot of other plugins. Remember though, everything on this really hangs on the preface of you having Litespeed. If you don't have Litespeed like this website, then some of the features don't work. The image compression doesn't work. The critical CSS generation doesn't work. And I could probably find a lot more options that aren't going to work. The ESI, that's probably not going to work. But if you're in a situation where you have Litespeed, it would be really tough to beat this plugin. There are some premium plugins out there who I would say are just as good, if not better. But this plugin is definitely built for Litespeed, and at the low cost of free, it would almost be silly not to use it. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me in the comments below. If you're needing your website professionally optimized or you're just looking to get more videos, feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.